Good evening, and welcome back to the Muddy Creek podcast. So, I told you at the beginning of the year we're going to start to take the podcast in a different direction and open our doors more to the outdoor subject and bring more people in that's outside of the normal round of topic we have. And I got to tell you, when I reached out to our guest tonight, as I was telling Don, he had, you got to respect the man. The man didn't even flinch when he found out what kind of podcast we were at. He was like, you know what, Victoria, I'll be there. And we were talking to him, backstage, and he's a really great guy. But the story behind him is so incredible, and I'm so honored to have him here, and I just resonate with him so much. He is the CEO of Survival Dispatch, and his story of how he got there is absolutely incredible. And not only is his story incredible, but just getting inside of his head and the knowledge that he has is just beyond me. So tonight we're going to hit on a little bit on his background. We're going to hit on Survival Dispatch, which is an outstanding. If you have never heard of Survival Dispatch, which everybody has, but if you have not, please go over to his YouTube channel, check out the tiers there, the information that you can get out of that podcast is one of the greatest information podcast I've ever seen in my life, and I'm just addicted to it. I binge on it, and I just really enjoy it. And Chris has his road has put him in a position that he needs to be in. And so tonight we're going to hit on a little of everything. Then we're going to go into some survival stuff. And yes, he will take your questions. I thank you for being respectful. And Chris, I really thank you for coming in tonight and sitting with us Bigfooters.
My pleasure, Victoria. I'll send you that $100 by PayPal for saying all.
Yes, thank you, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely my pleasure.
So, Chris, my favorite story about you is you were going to a Rocky, and I love Rocky. That I remember Thanksgiving. That used to be a tradition to sit down and root for the underdog. That is it's not really where your story begins, but it's where you show your first how strong-minded you can be in making changes, and when you want something, you go for something. Can we go into that?
Yeah, I'm a very stubborn person, and somebody once told me, they said, your greatest strength is usually your greatest weakness as well. And that's a good example of it. Being stubborn is good for accomplishing goals, but sometimes you don't catch other stuff that's important along the way, or you steamroll through stuff, and it's not necessarily always the best way to accomplish anything. But that part of my life, that was Labor Day weekend, 1982, and a friend of mine's parents piled us into an old Delta 98, big old boat, to go watch the all-night drive-in theater. And Rambo First Blood was playing. I was 120 pounds soaking wet, freshman. And I said to my buddies, I said, I'm going to look like Sylvester Stallone. And they were like, yeah, sure you are. And I got my first gym membership the Tuesday after Labor Day, 1982. And that set a whole bunch of things in play in my life. So I competed on our national powerlifting team for 25 years, set world records in multiple different weight classes. I competed 181, 198, 220, 242, 275, because they're all kilograms get converted. First guy under 200 pounds to bench press over 600 pounds. Good way to wreck your body along the way. I call it the balls bigger than the brain syndrome. I've been afflicted with it for most of my adult life. So that was always my alter ego as far as like recreation was concerned. I always wanted to be the strongest guy in the room, pound for pound. So, and when I compete in powerlifting, you can do what's called a DEXA scan, where they stick you in this tank full of water. And it's the most accurate way of measuring your body fat. And I competed sub 4% body fat in powerlifting, not bodybuilding, which was an anomaly because most of the guys who compete in powerlifting have a big belly and all that stuff that goes with it.
But, also in your life, you have overcome a lot of tragedies. You've had some severe wrecks, and you've been life flighted out, quite a few.
Yeah, the first one was November 2nd, 1996, Pulaski, New York. Track blew off a snowmobile. I crested a hill on a forest access road, and there was a guy sitting on the other side of the road down a bit, and he mashed the throttle when I come over the hill, and the track came off at an angle like this. So it shattered my visor. I had sunglasses on. It shattered them. I had a steel stud buried in my left eye. When I took my helmet off, there's blood everywhere, but my ear was in my helmet, and total state of shock. And so I had to wait for a chopper to get me out of there, and they kept taking me from one hospital to another because of the extensive injuries I had, and they were looking for an eye surgeon and stuff. And so that laid me up for a couple of years, 14 surgeries to get through that. But half a dozen times I've been airlifted. Not one of those wrecks my fault, by the way. Last one was 2012. I was T-boned in east side of Orlando. A lady hit me at 65 mile an hour in an intersection. She blew through 2 red lights. I broke C2, C3, C4, L4, tore the posterior labrum left shoulder, tore my infraspinatus, and punctured my spleen. And then not too long after that, 2017, I blew my abdominal wall out under 700 pounds on the bench press. So when your abs split vertically, it's typically pregnant women. It's called diastasis recti. So I blew out my abdominal wall vertically, and then I took out both inguinal canals at the same time. So they sutured the middle of my abs together. Extensive surgery, it was like 7 hours. And they put mesh in both inguinal canals. And the mesh was one of the ones that never had any lawsuits and still hasn't had any lawsuits. But my body rejected the mesh. So I couldn't even stand for 10 seconds without being in excruciating pain. I had to carry a hunting stool with me everywhere I went. So I went back in for another round of surgery. And it's like picking bubble gum out of your hair. And so I was in the hospital for 4 days. They sent me home, and all of a sudden I couldn't breathe. And I was sitting on the end of the bed, and my wife's like, do we need to call 911? And I said, yeah, I can't breathe. It feels like somebody stabbed me in the back. It's the one and only time in my life I have no recollection of what happened after that. I remember getting me to the front door. I don't remember the paramedic showing up. I don't remember the trip to the hospital. But they get me to the hospital, and my wife and my mother are there. And I don't remember what my blood pressure was. She does. It was like something like 270 over 190 or something crazy like that. And they were pumping me full of all these drugs. There was like half a dozen doctors there, and they gave up. They went to my wife and they said, there's no way he hasn't had a stroke. Go say goodbye. He's not going to make it. And somehow she got through to me, being the cement head that I am. So they put me in critical care and then ICU. And I woke up 5 days later, and the only recollection I had of the whole thing was Halifax Hospital is one beside the Speedway in Daytona. So when you see a NASCAR crash, that's where they take everybody. And it wouldn't be but half a mile away. And they've got a huge underground parking garage, which is unusual here in Florida. And the only recollection I had is I thought I was on a gurney in the parking garage, and that the Grim Reaper was trying to hook me and take me away. That's all, the only memory I had of that. So yeah, I've been through some crazy stuff, more than just that. But people say all the time, "How you doing today, Chris?" I'm like, I'm just happy to be here. So,
That's a good way to look at it. You brought up a good point. I have found, even with myself, when I was in that situation, doctors will underestimate your will to live.
I don't disagree, although I have no recollection.
Right.
So, Don, do you have any questions at this point? Because
No, not yet.
I will override Don. It's like a bad marriage between me and him.
No,
I'll let you know.
So you eventually started doing courses, which led you. We went into the red hat and the your life from the construction business to your studies in the cyber world, and how it brought you to the CEO of Survival Dispatch.
So I don't want to bore your audience. I'll give you all the Cliff Notes version here. So I grew up in the construction industry. My family built a whole bunch of big projects in Texas back in the day, stuff like Montgomery Wards. And my uncle was friends with the CEO of a large chain of lumber yards. We're going back into the late 80s, early 90s. And he got me a job there. And the funny thing is, the president of that company, he was like, I already have somebody for this position. The only reason that you're here is because your uncle's relationship. And I got to tell you, You're pretty cocky and you don't know near as much as what you think you do. And he was right. He was 100% right. He said, so y'all are going to have a 90-day competition, and whoever's left standing after 90 days will get the job. And this other guy was in his mid-30s. He was a rock star, but I'm stubborn, and somehow I managed to outperform him sales-wise. So while I was there, they wanted to tie together 300 lumberyards, dozen distribution centers in real time. But this was before the internet. So everything was twisted pair copper, digiboards, mux lines, antiquated technology. And I had learned to program in the late 1970s because my grandparents' neighbor here in Ormond Beach, Florida, was the head programmer for the city of Orlando's traffic division. So he had an IBM mainframe, taught me how to program on punch cards, et cetera, et cetera. So I sat on this team that interfaced with Digital Equipment Corporation, because when you're building that type of system that runs every aspect of a large corporation, you essentially have to tell the software company what your SOPs are, so to speak, standard operating procedures. So I made a lot of really good friends at Digital Equipment Corporation. They got acquired by Compaq. Compaq was a Microsoft PC shop, so a pretty big disconnect between enterprise level stuff and desktop stuff. So most of them left because of that culture clash and ended up at Sun Microsystems. Meanwhile, I had this wreck. That's a prosthetic eye, by the way, which is a result of that wreck. I was bored. I live in the country. They took my driver's license away. So I got certified in Red Hat Linux, which is a Unix clone. And these guys were calling me and they're like, hey man, when can you go back to work? And we want you to come to Sun Microsystems. We're the Cowboys of Silicon Valley. And I mean, I was born in cowboy boots and jeans, and it was a really good fit for me between my culture and technology and all that kind of stuff. So I ended up at Sun Microsystems. And so I had Unix and Linux certification, systems engineer, network engineer, but I'm pretty good at sales. I'm a college dropout, but I'm pretty good at sales. So I ended up a national level BDM, business development manager. So there were 4 of us, and we each had 400 PDMs under us, so partner development managers. And there's all total probably about 1,700 people. We looked after 10,000 channel partners across North America. And we were getting our lunch eaten by Linux on commodity hardware. Unix hardware and software is like insanely expensive, right? And so I got put on this team, and the team was 3 of us, by the way. And they were like, we need you to come up with a strategy to fight, this commodity stuff that's eating our lunch at the edge of the network. So keep in mind, we were the 20th largest company in the world at the time. We were doing over 20 billion a year in revenues. We had 7 billion in cash in the bank. I mean, we were a happening thing. So the 3 of us, we ended up put this program together for our channel partners. I won't get into the boring details, but we did 138 million in revenue in the first year with 0 budget. And then the second year, we did 500 million in revenue with 0 budget. And we got called into the principal's office, which was Scott McNeely, the CEO and founder of Sun. And the third year, that business unit is still with no budget, did $1 billion in revenue. That business unit today does about 15 billion a year in revenue at Oracle. So I ended up on the cover of a global print magazine called Computerworld, and I was on it twice for building this business unit with no budget. And the first time I was on a month after Bill Gates, and the second time I was on a month before Steve Jobs. I don't belong in their category. I'm the Forrest Gump of the tech industry, college dropout, just very blessed to be included in some really amazing things. And so that we ended up getting acquired by Oracle. Now we were in a culture clash because they were like stuffed shirts. And again, we're cowboy boots and jeans guys, right? So a handful of us broke off. We started a boutique consulting firm that catered to Fortune 1000s. We had 49 systems engineers, a dozen people on the ops team, blah, blah, blah. And fast forward a little bit, and we ended up getting a contract with a gun company. And being the gun nut amongst that group, I was the lead on. And they had 21 what are called LOBs, lines of business. And they ended up in a very brutal patent lawsuit. There was fault on both sides. They got smoked reputationally and financially. We weren't going to get paid. I knew we weren't going to get paid. It wasn't out of malice. I still speak to the guy who owned it. He's a great human being. And I said to him, tell you what, give me the assets to Survival Dispatch. We'll call it a day. And the assets to Survival Dispatch weren't worth a fraction of what I was owed. But I had a vision that I could changed the last leg of my career into something I really wanted to do. So the mission for Survival Dispatch is really simple. Our job is to dispatch information so our fellow Americans and friends of America can survive in these very uncertain times. So that could be everything from, how do you purify water to, how do you make fire with very little tools at your disposal, all the way to the fact that 83% of Americans live in cities, urban areas. So if you were going to prep for something, being in North Carolina, you're going to get this. Here in the Southeast, we prepare for what's most likely to happen, and that's hurricanes. So it would be, I'm not saying it'd be stupid, but it'd be a waste of your time and resources to prepare for, let's say, wildfires like they've been having in California. Okay. So when people ask me, like, what should I be prepping for? Whatever the biggest threat is for your whatever part of the country or the world that you live in. So if we accept the fact that most people live in cities, urban survival is a big deal. If you take convenience stores and gas stations, those are 2 top 5 areas for being accosted. And I call these things weapons of mass distraction. 1999, I'm representing 2 business units at Sun. One of them sends me a BlackBerry, the other one sends me a palm tree. And I'm like, as a tech guy, I'm like, man, this is really cool. And like 3 weeks later, I was like, oh my God, I can't get away from this thing. My phone is on do not disturb 24/7, 365. And a handful of people like my wife can break through it, call through it, but I don't let this thing run my life. But what I'm getting at gas stations, somebody will get out of their car. Maybe it's a female. She leaves her pocketbook in the front passenger seat. She's standing between the car and the gas pump. She's got her weapon of mass distraction that she's looking at. She's a prime target. And again, it's a top 5 place to be accosted. So we teach simple stuff, phone down, eyes up when you're in any of these transition spaces like gas stations. And let me give you a really good example. I have a really good friend of mine. Right on. I have a really good phone. That's awesome. Yeah. I have a good friend of mine named Tony Blauer. You can look him up. He's the preeminent global expert on sudden violence. And he thinks just really different ways to everybody else, which is why he's so unique. So he has this thing that he calls D1, D2, D3. So the best fight is the fight that never happens, right? So D1 would mean from a distance, you detect danger and choose safety. And we are the only living beings on this planet who ignore our gut feeling. Every single person who has had a near-death experience and lived has gone on to say, it just didn't feel right. But a cat sees a dog, the cat runs away. But as human beings, we'll ignore our gut instincts and continue on in the face of danger. So D1, detect it from a distance. Distance is safety. Avoid the problem, okay? In other words, you pull off the interstate, you drive up to a gas station and it doesn't look very welcoming, choose safety. Drive to the next one a mile down the road. What did it cost you? 5 minutes of your life? Don't stop where it's really dangerous. Go ahead, Victoria.
You had a story about a lady that was in one of your tiers, and she used something that she learned from this gentleman that saved her life at the gas pumps.
Kudos for remembering that. It's an amazing story. This lady had taken a 1-day workshop from Tony Blauer years ago. She calls Tony up and she's like, you saved my life last night. And Tony's like, well, how did I save your life? And she said, well, I left work. It was late in the day. I was on a conference call. I took my phone with me. And she says, I'm driving down the interstate and the dashboard's going off. I'm out of fuel. So she pulls off the interstate, pulls into a gas station while she's still on the conference call. No sooner realizes that she stopped in a really bad part of town and that 3 guys had taken an interest in her and were moving towards her. So she thought back to the training that Tony gave her. So D1, detect and avoid. D2, which is now where she was, because she couldn't avoid it now, is to devalue yourself as a target. Thieves only want 1 of 3 things: body, property, life. That's it. They're not after anything else, okay? So she starts screaming into the phone. She put it on mute, but she's still on this conference call. She starts screaming in it, saying, you assholes better turn my credit card back on. I'm stuck at this dang gas station. I don't have any money on me. My credit card doesn't work. My car's out of fuel. The 3 guys stopped. They walked away. The car had no fuel. She had no cash. Credit cards didn't work. She was of no value to them, and they walked away.
And she
And
was on the phone with someone.
like, kudos for her, right? Because most people freeze up. Like, let me give you a really interesting number, and then I'll tell you what D3 is. 70% of Floridians who are killed by gunshot wound that did not commit suicide are shot with their own gun. So Colonel Jeff Cooper came up with what's called the combat mindset many, many years ago. And what it basically is, y'all are at home. I'm at home. Right now, we're in condition white. We're not worried that, there's imminent danger that somebody's going to come in and shoot us or whatever. But when we leave the house, we look both ways before we cross the street. That you could call that, say, condition yellow. Okay. Then maybe you get into a busier place and maybe there's some people acting unruly, whatever the case may be. Now you've elevated to condition orange. And if you get the condition red, that's when the shit's hitting the fan. It's either means that you're being attacked or you're fixing to be attacked. Okay. Well, the next part is condition black. And that's why those 70% of Floridians killed by gunshot or killed with their own gun is because they're confronted with some attack. They pull the gun, they freeze. Condition black, the bad guy takes the gun away from them and shoots them. So in order to get around that, you have to engage in what's called stress inoculation. I'll just give you the Cliff Notes version of this. So if there's a great video out there of a construction worker, he's got an F-350 one-ton dually, he's got the toolboxes on the back, and he gets carjacked. And so he pulls his sidearm, and the guy's in the driver's seat. The door to the truck is open. He's 5 feet away, takes 6 shots, and none of them hit the driver. The guy puts it into reverse and gets about 50 foot away from him, and then mashes the throttle, runs over him, and kills him. And so when our heart rate is elevated and we're not in condition black now, we're condition red. If you haven't trained under those types of circumstances, you lose all your fine motor skills, your accuracy goes out the window. And so you have to practice the way that you're going to play. So for myself, I put 1,000 rounds down week every single week because that's my form of physical exercise now because I just don't have the time I used to get to the gym. So what that means is I might take I've actually got a training rifle beside me. I'll show you in a minute. Could be live fire, whatever, but I'll sprint, volley of shots, do an exercise, sprint, and I do that for 45 minutes nonstop, 0 breaks, heart rate 140, 145 beats per minute, also shooting while I'm running, which is really hard if you've never done it. So the idea is that Sun Tzu, one of his adages is that human beings never rise to the occasion, they fall to their level of training. So you need to train at a level where you're so stressed that when the shit really does hit the fan, it kicks into, autopilot, right? And it works. And it's what we do with our spec ops guys, SWAT team guys, et cetera, et cetera. So I tell people, you can go to the range and you'll increase your familiarity with the controls on your weapon. You can dial in your optics and stuff, but that's not a real world thing. Number one. Number two, most people don't want to spend money on sending EDC ammo downrange. So they shoot ball ammo that's heavy and clunky and the gun behaves completely differently. I only shoot, for example, the 9mm that I shoot is Pilgrim ammo. It's a 50 grain projectile traveling over 2,000 feet per second, which is crazy for 9mm. Goes in about 4.5, 5 inches and then breaks into petals essentially. It doesn't mushroom out. So you get this crazy horizontal hydrostatic shock. So there are 0 recorded instances of overpenetration, killing somebody behind your target. But we had a $900 ballistic dummy sent to us. Most of them are about half that price. And it was like ultra realistic. And James from Pilgrim Ammo said, hold on. He said, before we shoot this thing up, let's put one right here in the shoulder just to see what happens. So normally if you hit somebody in the shoulder here, it wouldn't necessarily be a fatal shot. You're not hitting any major arteries. You're not hitting a major organ or anything like that. So he had some of his 40 Smith & Wesson ammo, and we winged it right here. It was on the ground, and it turned the entire left side of the heart into jello from the hydrostatic shock. It would have been a kill shot.
Wow.
We've got gel blocks. I've actually got some sitting behind me that when you see slow motion on camera, the damage is just incredible. So what I'm getting at is you don't go to the range and shoot, FMJ ball ammo and then dump it and put your EDC ammo back in, because believe it or not, with that performance of ammo, you get very little muzzle flip and you get about 35% less recoil out of it. It's actually nicer and easier to shoot, but expensive. Okay. So point being in all of this stuff is people need to get professional training, and these are perishable skills. You got to practice them on a regular basis or you will lose them. And so for me, I love guns. I love physical exercise. So I've got dumbbells and bands that I do all these exercises while I'm training. And I love training with SBR, short barrel rifles. So I can go out and I can shoot 1,000 rounds. Well, here's a funny example. In the fall, it was pouring rain. It was like 9 o'clock at night. I had a busy day, hadn't had a chance to train yet. I start going outside with a gun, and my wife's like, "Where on earth are you going?" I said, "Well, you don't get to choose when the shit hits the fan, so I'm going to go train in the pouring rain." So I put 480 shots downrange on a bunch of steel targets, and I missed one shot. And again, this was shoot, run, exercise, 140, 150 beats per minute heart rate. I'm not claiming that I'm like the best in the world or anything like that at all. But it's amazing when you start doing this stuff. Like having one eye, I have vision in this eye. When I look through an optic and I've got an SBR, I have no peripheral vision to speak of. So when I first started training with that way back when, I mean, I couldn't keep the gun on target, as I'm walking towards the threat. It was just terrible. And I spoke to a friend of mine who has trained all kinds of SWAT teams and stuff. And he gave me a bunch of tips. He's like, don't lift your feet, just kind of glide across the ground and stuff. And I use a lot of products from Mantis because they connect to your phone and they tell you if your gun's cantilevered, if you pulled the trigger and it pulled it off target, measures the barrel before, during, and after the trigger pull. So it'll tell you all kinds of neat things to correct. So long story short is I would consistently shoot like 92, 95% with the Mantis, and all of a sudden I'm shooting like 40%. And that's no good for Chris Evan, because I'm my own worst critic, right? And I've got to do better. And it took me about a month to get back up to 92+% while I was moving. But I guarantee you, if I stopped doing that training for any period of time, I would lose that skill. I would have to reacquire it all over again. So I'm not suggesting people do extremes like me. Again, biggest strength, greatest weakness, right? I've got OCD. I've got to improve. And if I don't, then I think I failed.
The thing about training, as you said, in a high stress situation, you automatically fall back on your training. And one of the best examples I can give you, when it hits the fan, you live your training. Your training is, you do it, you don't think about it. I remember, a North Carolina highway patrolman back when they carried revolvers. I'm kind of dating myself, but there was a return of fire situation, and when they were, the state showed up on the scene, they're looking for his brass, and he doesn't know where his brass is at. Well, back then they were trained that when they to ditch their brass, when they dump their brass from the, I can't remember. So
from a service revolver.
Yeah, you just dump it in your hand, and
Yep.
you have, but they would put the brass in their pocket at the firing range.
Yeah.
So they're looking everywhere for this brass, and he happens to put his hand in his pocket, all of his brass. Through all of this high stress, high intense situation, his brass still went in his pocket. And it's just like when I was on the street and I heard gunfire and it was close, first thing I did was hit the ground. I had no shame in my game, or you look for that cover.
Yeah.
So you're going to fall back on that training, and that training is essential. It's just like drawing your gun out of your holster, knowing the level of your holster, how fast do you get, like dry firing, and that's really important. I'm glad you hit on that.
I made a mistake years ago in a conversation with Tony Blauer. And I think back to playing high school football. My coach would always say, run it again, muscle memory, blah, blah, blah. And so I said muscle memory to Tony Blauer, and he's like, there's no such thing. I said, what do you mean there's no such thing? He says, well, he said, and we were over a Zoom, and he picks up a pistol, and he says, if we were face to face right now and you cut off my arm, could I shoot you? I'm like, well, no. And he says, well, if there was muscle memory, the muscles would be able to pull the trigger. He said, it's no muscle memory. You're burning neural pathways in your brain. And he's way smarter than I am. But essentially, that's it. You're connecting the dots faster in your brain, so fast that you don't even realize what's going on. The human brain's amazing with things like that. Like if you've ever shot indoors with no hearing protection, especially in a high stress environment, which I have, you would think you go deaf, but you go into auditory exclusion. So your body shuts down your hearing to protect itself. And it's very surreal. When you're in those types of situations, you can literally see the projectile leaving the gun. It's like you're in the Matrix or something like that. But at the end of the day, practice is everything. Burn the neural pathways and good things come out of that.
I do have a first question for you. Thank you, Bobby. Is there a place in Central Florida to learn gun safety? And this is from Miss Bobby.
Yeah, so I've got a buddy. His name's Elvis Ray. He's in St. Augustine. And so he was former military and Coast Guard. And a buddy of his trains law enforcement across the country. He was in law enforcement himself for years. He's got a private range. You can't even buy a membership to it. And if somebody's looking for really good one-on-one training, Elvis Ray is a great guy. So REY. And then if you're over on the other side of Central Florida towards Groveland, there's a place called WOFT, WOFT, Where Our Families Train. And if somebody's got deep pockets, it's not cheap. It's probably the premier non-law enforcement, non-military training facility in the country. And if you go to like any map application, you type in WOFT, it'll put a balloon down in the middle of the Gulf of America because you got to sign up. They got to find out who you are before they even tell you how to get there. And then there's another place in Orlando. It's a chain. I think it's called Shoot Smart, if memory serves me right. I had a friend work for them years ago, 5 miles from Groveland. Well, that's exactly where WOFT is. That's funny. Small world. I think it's Shoot Smart, I think is the name of it. And I want to say they probably have like a dozen locations across Central Florida now. And they've got some really good indoor training. And another part to this as well is that you mentioned it yourself, Victoria, it doesn't have to be live fire. It could be dry fire training. And that just tweaked me on the neural pathway. So listen to this one. Have you seen the dry fire training systems like the Strikeman and stuff? So you've got a little laser that you put in the barrel of the gun, but it doesn't reset the trigger. So, you pull the pistol trigger, you shock it, you pull it, you shock it, you pull it, you shock it. Highly recommend that people never, ever, ever do that. Get a system that resets the trigger. And let me give you a funny story. I mean, I literally have failed more times than anybody I've ever met. And that's like my secret superpower. I'm not afraid of failing. If I hit a brick wall, I will back up and keep running into it, over it, around it, whatever it takes to get past the wall at some point in time. So we had a couples competition, and the first couple was 10 years younger than my wife and I, and the next couple was 10 years younger than them. And we had these 3 barrels set up where it was 50 yards from this barrel to the next barrel to the next barrel. And the third barrel was 50 yards from the targets. Okay. So the deal was husband and wife, this was dry fire system, Mantis X, Blackbeard X, is from a prone position, lying down. You take a shot, you get up, you sprint to the next one, take a knee, take a shot, sprint to the next one, standing, take a shot, then give her the gun and you take the iPad or whatever's connected to it. Now, while this is going on, the other 2 couples are in the bullpen trying to rack up as many reps as they can doing one particular exercise. Okay. So we end up going first, and we ended up right in the middle. We were a little off on the reps from the ones who were 20 years younger than us, but our shooting was about equal. And the other couple were in really good shape, but they've never done any training like this. And probably they were physically better shape than all of us, and they scored the lowest because they hadn't trained in this stuff. But this is where it gets funny. The Mantis X was telling me on the app about a month before that there was a problem with my third trigger pull. So I thought to myself, okay, for the next month, I'm going to do nothing but triple taps. So I'd be stationary, triple tap, run, exercise, triple tap. So when we did this couples competition, I couldn't pull the trigger less than 3 times. We're supposed to shoot once and then move to the next station every single time. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I kept saying to myself, holy crap, like I can't stop. And I had burned that neural pathway so much. I couldn't get out of it, sort of thing. And that's when it dawned on me, boy, like it's good to be stubborn and set a goal and practice the heck out of it, but you got to vary it up, because in a real world situation, that may not be optimum. What happens if I pull the trigger once and now all of a sudden there's a child behind my target and I'm sitting here triple tapping, sort of thing? So the reason I mentioned the dry fire was shucking it like the Strikeman system. I would imagine if you did that enough times and the shit hit the fan, that when you pull the trigger, you would instinctively want to shuck the rail, which is the last thing you'd really want to do in that type of situation. So anyway, at the end of the day, there's value in changing it up on a regular basis.
That's like law enforcement. You always do the double tap.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely understand that. You guys go into almost anything for as far as survival, but what would you tell someone who's putting their daughter or their son on the road, go across country to a college system or to a college or away from home on their first long road trip? What advice would you give them to stay safe on the road?
So that's a really good question, Victoria. You hear people discussing all the time bug out bags, right? But again, 83% of Americans live in cities. They have nowhere to bug out to. And the last thing you want to do is end up in a FEMA refugee camp. You, being in North Carolina, will really understand that. So we tell people is to pack a bag with a different purpose in mind, and it's a get home bag. So what's in your get home bag? Well, the basics is you have to have water, and you can go theoretically 3 days without water, but anybody who's done it for 2 days like I have will tell you that your cognitive ability completely tanks at around the 36 hour mark. So making good decisions to survive those first 3 days aren't going to happen if you don't have water. So you have to have water, and you have to have a means to clean water. So the mini Sawyer, American made in Tampa, 0.1 micron filter. We have tested $1,000 systems that have had worse results than a little $15, $20 Sawyer Mini has had. The Life straws and stuff like that, they're Chinese made products. They're not consistent QA, QC. We've tested water in that, sent it away, and it's come back with all kinds of contaminants in it, like biological contaminants. So water and a means to filter water. The big ones, right, are water, food, and shelter. So typically, if you have a good first aid kit, that'll give you at least a very minimal shelter, and you'll have like a Mylar blanket where you could at least, create some sort of dry structure. Communications. So if you ever driven across I-10, in West Texas, there's all kinds of dead areas where you have no comms for your phone. It's going to die. So there's a little device. If I had a child sending them across country, and there's one sitting right over here, and it's called a Garmin InReach Mini. The Mini 2 is the latest one. And I want to say it's $399 and like $12 a month, but you can turn the subscription on and off as you want. And it's a satellite communicator. So if you have no cell phone service, you can still send and receive text messages, number one. Number two, you can drop breadcrumbs. So as your child travels across the country, it can show you where they are in real time, where they've been, how long they were at each location. So let's say, for example, hey, Mom, I'm going to stop and get gas and a bite to eat. And you notice that 2 hours later, they're still in the same location. That's an immediate clue that you should reach out to them, right? And so the Garmin InReach Mini 2 is a fantastic little device from that perspective. And then, of course, a ways to defend yourself. So you have to be aware of what the rules are state to state as far as weapons are concerned. But we work with a company called CCW Safe because other companies sell you an insurance policy. And I'm not going to name names, okay, because I'm not really in the business of hurting other people's businesses. Here's the deal, though. There's a federal law that makes it illegal for an insurance company to pay you benefits if you broke the law doing whatever it is. Okay. So 95% of criminal charges are pled out before it gets in front of a judge or a jury. Okay. So let's say you have a Soros-backed DA and you get charged with some form of homicide because you were in a citizen-involved shooting, and you get right to the end, and your attorney says, listen, plead to this lesser charge, don't roll the dice and risk spending decades in jail. Well, that insurance company that you bought self-defense insurance from now has to claw back. They're called recoupment clauses. They have to claw back everything they paid out because you've admitted to breaking the law, even if you didn't, to avoid potentially being put in jail for decades. CCW Safe doesn't do that. You get membership benefits, and they have what's called a captive insurance policy on their business. And what that means is that they are insured against financial loss for their business, but they're not selling you an insurance policy. They're selling you membership benefits. So they've got a rapid response team, number one. Number two, they're the only people who've successfully defended murder one charges and got people off those charges. If there's a civil judgment, that gets cleared up as well. There's some pretty high profile cases where other people who sell the self-defense insurance drop somebody, clawed the money back. The person then ended up in jail because they had no representation. And then they also lost the civil case because the company had already bailed out on them. So I would highly recommend all the things I've already said, being up to speed on guns, having training on guns, but also having CCW Safe. They're a very Christian organization. And what that means is that all the other ones have like family plans, but you have to pay extra for it. CCW Safe, you don't. So we pay $47 a month for the Mac Daddy package, and it's on me, but my wife Cindy is automatically included because she's my wife at no additional charge. So those would be the big things: is get the weapons training, be proficient using the gun, know the laws as you're passing through different states, have CCW Safe, and have a badass get home bag that has your Garmin, it has the food, water, shelter, all those things available, a good first aid kit. You coming from law enforcement, you've probably heard this 1,000 times. If you have the ability to put holes in somebody, you should have the ability to plug holes, meaning that have a tourniquet and know how to use it. Just a quick anecdotal story. This is crazy. So Jason Sawyer is one of our neighbors in North Georgia. He's been on all of these survival shows. The guy's incredible. Him and a couple of his buddies decided a couple of years ago that they were going to take their kids 14 miles from home with nothing but backpacks. They were going to camp for one night, and then they're going to walk 14 miles home the next day. Well, one of the guys who was leading that was a spec ops medic. And so he threw a bunch of curveballs at them. So as they're walking along, all of a sudden, well, time out, stop. You're bleeding out and you need to rescue them. And, picked all these people who was, shot and who need to rescue them. And the whole crew were very skilled people. And 50% of them failed in getting the tourniquet applied in 60 seconds or less because they hadn't practiced it. They didn't even know where the tourniquet was. They knew it was in the FAK, but where in the FAK first aid kit, they didn't know. And so it was a really good refresher that you got to know how to use all this stuff. And there's another saying in the survival community: the more that you know, the less that you need to take with you, the less tools you need, et cetera, et cetera. And that's good. I'm a tech guy, so I fall in the middle. I want to have the knowledge, but also want to have some badass equipment.
You're right.
I call it a jump bag because you're going to jump up and go.
Yeah.
That's just, I call it a jump bag. But when you were talking about the water filtration center system, you have said prior that there is, I think it's ewg.org, where even if you have a well, you should go to this website and see what the quality of your water is in your area. And there's a reason you said that, because your dogs got sick.
And one of them's beside me right here, and we just lost another one to cancer. So my wife and I, we've had power breeds forever and a day. We end up here in Ormond Beach, 15 years now. And all of a sudden our dogs, they're all getting cancer and mast cell tumors, they're called. and one of them was like just a specimen. He would go 15 feet straight up a palm tree to get squirrels out of the trees and stuff like that. And so we said to our vet, as a friend of ours, like, well, Will, what's going on here? Like, there's got to be something local here because we've never had this problem before. And he's like, no, it's the breed. And we're like, no, we've had these breeds forever and we've never had this problem. So I stumbled across Environmental Working Group, which is what EWG stands for. And they've been around for over 30 years. And they have this database of municipal water supplies around the country. You punch in your zip code and it'll tell you what's in your water for PFAS or PFAC, forever chemicals, right? And what was that movie years ago that Julia Roberts was in? Um,
Aaron
Aaron
Brockovich.
Brockovich.
Yeah.
that's it. So that's one of the things that spurred EWG to start their nonprofit. So, for example, here in Ormond Beach, Florida, there are half a dozen highly carcinogenic PFAC, forever chemicals in our water at up to 500 times the safe level. And it's a epidemic across the country, and it's fueling cancer and dogs, cats, humans, the whole 9 yards. So I want to say at last count, it was somewhere around 80% of municipal water supplies have unsafe levels of forever chemicals. Okay. The only way to get them, by the way, is an RO unit, reverse osmosis. So reverse osmosis, yeah, we'll use sound waves. So you can't see them, but it's still a particulate that can be pushed through a membrane, right? And that's how RO works, is you've got this radio frequency pushes those particulates through the membrane, and now you get the chemicals out, sort of thing. There's other people who claim they can do it. We've never seen anything pass the tests except for RO units, okay? So the next thing is people like, oh, well, I've got a well, I'm okay. Well, we have a well at our place in Georgia that is okay because we're at the end of a private road, at the end of a private driveway, at the top of the mountain, and the water is literally pouring out the side of the mountain in one of our old wells. We've tested it. It's as clean as it gets. But a lot of places, when you have a well, you've got runoff from roads. So chemicals that have gotten on the roads is now going into your well. You got farmers spreading pesticides. You got the runoff from that going into your well. Maybe you live close to an industrial area. You've got water leaching into your well. So there's only two places in the country that test for PFAC, forever chemicals. The one is $450. The other one's $500. But if your animals are getting cancer, you probably get it yourself. And so I have a very good friend of mine, Todd Callender, and he was diagnosed with cancer at 14. At 40, he was 6 feet tall, 109 pounds, told he had 4 weeks to live. He was going to be dead. And his doctor, who was a friend of his, took him to Mexico at the time, and they treated him with chlorine dioxide. And chlorine dioxide has nothing to do with bleach. It's a big misnomer, okay? And he walked back into that oncology department 4 weeks later, and he was back up to about 140 pounds and zero trace of cancer. We've had people write to us at Survival Dispatch saying, I've got terminal stage 4 cancer, blah, blah, blah. And I tell them, look, email me your contact info and I'll see if Todd can help you. And Todd will send them out a care package. We have one guy, I'm allowed to use his name. His name's Kevin Ramsey. You'll see him all over our content. He had a tumor the size of my fist in one of his kidneys. It was stage 4. They said they couldn't even cut it out of the kidney because it was through the wall of the kidney and attached to other stuff in his abdomen. And Todd sent him the chlorine dioxide. This is crazy. He went back in 4 weeks later, and at that point in time, they were expecting to say to him, that you have whatever left, like a matter of weeks sort of thing. And they were like, we see the tumor, but it shrunk. So we need to take a biopsy. They took a biopsy and they said, we don't know what's going on here, but it's dead. Come back in 4 weeks. He came back in 4 weeks. There was no trace of it whatsoever. So it's an absolute miracle drug. Then you've got the other stuff that cancer cells progress in a similar manner to the way that parasites grow. So I'm not saying that cancer is parasitic, but they share some, and again, I'm a college dropout here, but they share some similar characteristics. So if you take fenbendazole, ivermectin, here's another thing. Cancer can only survive in an acidic environment. teaspoon of baking soda and distilled water in the morning, teaspoon baking soda, distilled water at night will change your chemical makeup to be alkalinic as opposed to acidic. So we've got a whole protocol that Todd gave us on ivermectin and fenbendazole. We know of half a dozen people who've done that instead of the chlorine dioxide. It's basically got 100% cure rate for prostate cancer, by the way. But big pharma, the medical industrial complex, they don't make any money off of healthcare for the three of us. They make money off of sick care. And, that's a whole super deep rabbit hole. But, 75% of advertising on legacy media is from big pharma, except presidential election years. Then it drops about 50%. And that's not so that you and I go to the doctor and say, hey, could I try this, whatever it is. It's because they get to tell those legacy media outlets what the narrative is and what they want the Mockingbird media to parrot over and over again. And because basically they say, either you do this, we'll cancel our advertising with you and you'll be out of business. So that's a very evil rabbit hole to go down.
It is, but it's the truth. I told you, feel free to say whatever you want to, because if I get bounced off of YouTube, I'm already on Rumble. So bouncing back to the water, is what you were talking about, was that the Kegel water system?
No.
Okay.
So do you mean one like RO that gets them out?
We have it's called the Kegel water, where it goes through a filter system, and it takes the alkaline up on it. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, is that a distiller by chance?
You hook it up to the actual faucet.
Okay. So unless one of the devices has reverse osmosis, you will not get the PFAC forever chemicals out. You will see many companies claim that they can get it out without RO, but I gave up on testing water treatment stuff a couple years ago. I was so upset because we spent a ton of time and money, and we had a $30 Brita outperform a $1,000 stainless steel countertop unit from another manufacturer. And there's a lot of snake oil stuff in that particular industry. And then we hit it off with Sawyer, and I said, all right, well, we'll take a crack at it. I'm not going to hold my breath. And we were pretty impressed with what their filters did as far as viral and, biological stuff, bacteria related. But still, at the end of the day, if you're going to get the PFAC forever chemicals out, you have to have reverse osmosis. The stuff from Water Drop is a good bang for the buck. It's not cheap, but it's not crazy expensive. So you can put a bunch of the stuff in line, right? Like you put a UV filter in to kill off bacteria and viral stuff. And, you can have, something that maybe adds chlorine. I don't like that, but some people do. Depends on how bad the water is. Then you can have the next one, say, does reverse osmosis. You can chain half a dozen of them together, but RO is the one you got to have to get the PFAC forever chemicals out, and that's the source of cancer. It's highly carcinogenic. Like, Don, do you live in an urban or rural location?
I live on the side of a hill, so my water is pretty clean. Yeah, I'm out in the middle of the woods.
So just out of curiosity, like if you was to take a zip code for Portland and plugged it in to ewg.org, I'd be curious what comes out of it, because like I say, about 80% are not good. Like if you want, Victoria, if you go to ewg.org, you can put our zip code in 32174 and you'll see all the crap that's in our water that's been killing our dogs. All of our dogs are on ivermectin now, which, by the way, ivermectin is the only active ingredient in HeartGuard so that dogs don't get heartworm.
Well, when I was living in, which I'll say it, when I was living in Parkman, my cats were, before I moved to that small town, my cats were living 20, 25 years. And I get there and their life shelf was 3 to 5 years. At 2 years, their teeth were being pulled. Mm-hmm. And I kept saying, it's got to be the water or something in the ground. And they're like, oh, no, our water is moderate or whatever. But, when I left there, my animals are healthy now. The older ones still have their, the side effects. But, I've never had animals where I've had to have all of their teeth pulled out at 2 years old.
It's brutal. Owning dogs and cats, it always ends in heartbreak no matter what, because they don't live as long as us. But then when they start dying off from cancer, it's even worse. We lost a dog, not too long ago to cancer, and it was absolutely horrific. His spleen burst in the middle of the night, and he went through many hours of pain. It makes you go blind. He howled in pain. It was so bad. And we were at our home in Georgia, and Cindy dug this like massively deep hole because we didn't want any critters coming and digging them up. And I was working, and then when I got off work, I helped her at the end. So we're talking, Billy was almost 6 feet under the dirt, and Bailey, who's beside me right now, she was a bait dog that we rescued. She's comes over, and we're talking on about a 30-degree slope on the side of a mountain, and she's trying to dig them up. And then the very next morning, she went straight to it and tried to dig them up again. I mean, it's again, we love dogs, but it always ends in heartbreak. And then you add cancer to it. It's a killer.
No, the ivermectin and the other one was chlorine dioxide, do you say?
Chlorine dioxide, okay.
Yeah. How are those available to the public?
So I don't know how you get chlorine dioxide, because Todd is a very notorious federal level attorney. He's the attorney who sued Lloyd Austin, the DOD, over the mRNA injections being forced on them. So there were 51 attorneys. He was the lead attorney. And because he'd been in front of the Supreme Court before. So he's got a 50,000 square foot office in Pompano Beach. And he has one room that is full of chlorine dioxide care packages. So every time I tell him, hey, I got somebody else needs help, we just send him the name and address, and one of his assistants sends it out. So I don't know where you would get it otherwise, number one. Number two, it's pricey, but you can go to Jace Medical. And I mean, maybe in the grand scheme of things, not really that pricey. So Jace make emergency medical kits, and they're around, say, $300. So you onboard with an MD on their website, and then they've got a box that says, do you plan on leaving the country anytime soon? And if you do, you get the option to buy ivermectin from them as well. And I think they limit you to like 30 12 milligram capsules, which, like, if you get sick with the flu, I went from January 1998 until December of 2023 without getting sick. Got the flu. I took 12 milligrams of ivermectin for 5 days in a Z-Pack, woke up on the 5th day perfectly healthy. And then, not this last trip to Vegas, but the one before that was last September. I get home, I'm sick. So I started again. And again, I haven't been sick in years. Day number 3, I was 100% cleared of the flu. So we buy ours through Jace. There's some offshore, like Indian companies and stuff you can buy from, but it always ends up in a issue trying to pay them, because none of the payment processors want to work with them. But we get ours from Jace Medical, JASE. And if you go to our website, I think we got a discount code. It's something like, Survival Dispatch 10 or something like that, or whatever it is. But that's where we get ours.
Okay.
It's pretty cool. You guys just offer a little bit of everything. So because we do deal with a lot of people that are outdoors, let's say we're getting a jump bag or a bug out bag ready for someone that's going hiking for the day. I know we've named some elements out there, but what do you get out of your experiences causes the most danger, or we're least prepared for when we go out into the woods or go on hikes or go camping? Did that even make sense?
Yeah, it did actually. So I'll speak in terms of your neck of the woods and where we've got our home in the Blue Ridge Mountains, but it's also applicable to the desert, somewhere like Nevada. When you have extreme highs and extreme lows, people are typically underprepared. So in other words, they get lost on a trail, which again is another good reason to have a Garmin InReach Mini, because it also sends all the maps to your phone, and highly detailed maps, topographical, get you out of, harm's way. But I don't think a lot of people realize things like, if you say we're not dressed appropriately and the temperature dropped, a lot of people wouldn't make a distinction in the mountains of, you can be 20 degrees difference from being 50 feet lower elevation close to a river or something like that. So there's a river, they've got some water, they see comfort in it, and they stay down there. And whereas if they had just gone another 50 feet higher up, they would have stayed a whole lot warmer, but they didn't want to sleep on an incline or whatever. So being underdressed and not being prepared for hypothermia, because hypothermia is crazy. Our neighbor in Georgia, she has done some of the craziest off-grid stuff over the years, and she got really sick and she broke her hip and blah, blah, blah. And a couple years ago, Christmas Eve, it was negative 20 degrees in the mountains where our place is. And she slipped and fell and got wedged up underneath the front porch. And she was losing it. She was going into hypothermia. And thank God another neighbor came along and found her. If that neighbor hadn't have found her, even though she had her phone on her, she had lost her faculties from the hypothermia. It's Don Mann is a very famous SEAL Team 6 guy, close personal friend of mine. We shoot TV shows together and stuff. He went into hypoxia on Mount Everest 7 or 8 years ago. He's an extreme athlete and he's mid-60s now. And most people would have never survived it. Somehow he got off of Mount Everest and survived. And he goes back every year now to kick Mount Everest's ass because it almost killed him. That's Don Mann, though. He's an exceptional man. This is a guy who wanted to go in to be a SEAL immediately. And they said, no, you have to serve in another trade for 2 years. So he was trained as a medic. And then he finally got into BUDS, which is the SEAL training. That 2-year period, he committed after every single day that he would do 1,000 of something, 1,000 push-ups, 1,000 sit-ups, 1,000 pull-ups, whatever it was. The guy's a machine. So when he got into the SEALs, he also got into doing triathlons, right? And he did a handful, maybe like 3 triathlons, and he got bored of them. So there's this thing that's like a 10X triathlon. So instead of running a 26.2 mile marathon, you run 262 miles. And then instead of bicycling 100 miles, you bicycle 1,000 miles. And instead of swimming, whatever it is, a few miles, it's absolutely insane. The guy's a machine, and he almost died on Mount Everest being in the condition that he's in. And it boiled down to basically losing your faculties because of hypothermia.
So some of your shows, and I just picked a few that you guys put out because you're constantly, one of my favorite is where the guy did the you're stranded. He had a Jeep. You're stranded. It's cold. Let's go through your Jeep. Let's see how it stays warm. And he was just having a lantern in your Jeep or a battery operated light in your Jeep was. He talked about how it was giving off heat. So you didn't think I watched your channel. I love it, but it gives off heat. And there's just, it's the little things that can save you. Some of the things you have videos survive in panic, like you're in the crowds. How do you react to the emergency situations? Situational awareness, recon. I think it was a recon reset or retreat. Recon retreat. I can't read my writing here. Home security, you hit that. You how to survive in sub-zero temperature. Urban recon. What out of all of the things you hit on, what do you think? And your guys included, you have some great guys out there to put this content out. What do you think that you have seen that has been put out on your channel that has been probably the most life-saving and had the most impact of any survival video you guys have put out there? What's the one that sticks out in your mind and you just watched when you guys put it out and you said, wow, that was awesome? Not to choose favorites, but
yeah, no, being gas station ready. Again, convenience stores, gas stations combined together, top 5 area to get assaulted. We have had people, much like the girl that Tony Blauer's training saved, we have people on a constant basis saying, well, so the bad guy always wants the element of surprise, okay? So every tiger in the world has a pattern on the back of its ears that look just like its eyes. So when it
Yeah.
goes to the watering hole and its ears flop over and a crocodile looks at it, the crocodile thinks that it does not have the element of surprise because it can see its eyes, right?
Okay.
So that's why phone down, eyes up is so important. If you make eye contact, now you got to be careful these days because of gangs like Trenda Aragua. Gangs like TDA will go 0 to 100 literally in the blink of an eye with no word spoken. They will attack you, they'll shoot you because you looked at them the wrong way, whatever the case may be. So there's no one size fits all here. But what I'm getting at is if you take the element of surprise away from the bad guy, your chances dramatically improve as far as not getting attacked. Now, if the person's high on drugs, it probably isn't going to help, because they just don't care, sort of thing. So that's where you have to fall back to, okay, not only am I paying attention, I have a sidearm. We got into Atlanta somewhere we shouldn't have been. That roads were closed. There were wrecks. There was construction. We were out of fuel. And I had a staccato on my hip and 2 mags. So I had 60 rounds plus 1 in the chamber. And you wouldn't want to go into this neighborhood at night. But everybody stood there watching me while I fueled up our vehicle because I clearly didn't belong in that neighborhood. But nobody made a move on us because I could see them whispering and talking. There's a time for open carry and a time not for open carry. You go out to dinner, you go to the mall, you go to a movie. That's not a good time to open carry because you're a target. But rest areas and unfamiliar gas stations, open carry is a deterrent. I walk away from the truck. I'm 20 feet away from the truck. I can see everything that's going on, and everybody can see I got a pistol on my side, and nobody messes with us. So being gas station ready, number one. Number two, another place where you're most likely to have a problem is your home in urban environments. So target hardening, right? Like, from being in law enforcement, if somebody wants in, they're going to get in no matter what you've done, right? But if you make it so that it slows them down, it buys you time, then that would be where we've also got a lot of comments where people have done what we've counseled them to do and it saved them. So in other words, we have a steel decorative door on the front, looks like a screen door, but it's steel and it's an outswing. Okay. It's locked. It's got a deadbolt. Then you have a man door behind that where we've taken all the screws out of the hinges because they normally come 1-inch screws. We put 3.5-inch screws, go all the way back to the jack studs. Okay. We've got glass in the door and we've got side lights, but we have a special version of a bar called a Doricade that actually locks in place so somebody can't put their fist through the window and pull this bar out of the way. And so if you had a breaching team, like when you're in law enforcement, the SWAT guys show up and you have somebody trained in breaching, they're going to get through the door. It's going to slow them down, but they're going to get through it in a matter of minutes, sort of thing, right? But your average thief is going to give up because they're making a racket. There's probably security alarms going off. There's lights. The cops have been called, and it takes too long to get in. And the other thing is windows, right? Like it's an easy way to break into somebody's home. So we have robollinis in front of all of our windows here. And robolini are these small palm trees that have 3-4-inch needles on them full of poison. It'll go through leather, denim, you name it. And I used to have a pretty good green thumb and I would get stuck by those things. And a week later, your hand's still swollen, still full of poison.
Wow.
So huckleberry, all like blueberry bushes, you can put them under your windows. Anything that's got thorns in it will slow people down. But I would say the gas station ready and home fortification are the two things that we have had the most real world experience from our people coming back to us, meaning our audience, to say, I think you saved our life, because you did these things.
I'll tell you a trick that was used on me one time. I was a rookie and we're doing, serving, we call them SWs. And I went, they said, well, hey, it's your SW. You got the PC for it. You go take the door down. So I was like, oh, I went running up there and went, you always hit that plate. And I went to hit the plate when the door gave, but it didn't give all the way. So I just kept, I'm like, well, what's going on? And what they had done, they put a deadbolt up real high and one real low. And you're like, that was a very valuable lesson learned for me. Very valuable lesson.
And not very expensive.
Yeah, not very expensive
at the end of the day, you can make it you can really slow somebody down and they'll give up. And the other thing is too, is you know, again, from being in law enforcement, when you drive around a residential neighborhood and you see motion lights and floodlights and stuff, that person's probably had a break-in at some point in time in one of their properties. And, you know, so if the bad guy goes by your house and they see motion lights, cameras, an extra door on the outside,
They're lazy.
bushes underneath the glass, no landscaping in the front yard that they can hide behind, fenced backyard, beware a dog sign, like it's cumulative, right? It's like, I'm going to go to the neighbor here. He's got no dogs. There's no lights.
Easy.
It's target hardening. But hey, when you mentioned jump medic, that's kind of ironic. So my mother was visiting in December for Christmas, and I get a call from my cousin, and they were beachside, and they had taken out a section of sidewalk and didn't put any pylons around it. And the lights were all off because of the last hurricane. They hadn't fixed the street lights. And my mother slipped off the edge and smashed her head on the ground. My cousin calls me. By the time we get there, was a bunch of good Samaritans. And as I'm leaving my office, I reach over here and I grab a first aid kit, and I grabbed the wrong one. And when I got there, I couldn't find, you know, an ice pack and all the stuff that I was looking for. We have no relationship with this company whatsoever, but there's a company called Jump Medic. And it's a young guy in his early 30s, born and raised in Oregon. They're fixing to move to Tennessee because of the crime in Oregon. And his side gig is this Jump Medic. He's a full-time paramedic. And I had hoped that I was going to grab his bag, right? So you can see here, let me get closer to my mic. All right, so you can see here, here's one of his bags. Jump Medic is the name across the top. But watch this. There's one zipper on each side. Okay, so both zippers are undone, and this is Velcro up here. So you pull the Velcro, and there you go. The whole thing lays out on the ground, and you can find everything without having to dump the contents of the bag. I meant to take this one, and I did, and I grabbed the wrong one, and I couldn't find that stuff. And the paramedics arrived before I was able to use anything from the kit. Whereas if I had had that kit, it would have been, as you see, you just lay it all out. It's right there. So
that's right there where you need it. That's right. I like that. I'll tell you something else that's a big deterrent is confidence. Not walking with your head down and just walking like I'm crazy. Don't mess with me. I don't care. And just stand focused on even if your knees are shaking, sometimes you've got to put that confidence down that I'm not a soft target and I will fight you back. I will bite you if I need to. Because
Absolutely.
People like a soft, they want something easy and they want to move on to, just leave you there and move on.
It's an analog to the what we just discussed with your home, right? They're going to take the path of least resistance. Mm-hmm. Simple as that. So if you're confident, absolutely. Another person's not confident, or the other person's got their face and their weapon of mass distraction. Yeah, they go after the easiest target always. Unless they're cracked out on some crazy drugs.
Yeah. So Jump Medic, they have a website.
Yeah, it's just jumpmedic.com.
Bobby, I hope that answers your questions. Don, do you have any questions?
Me? No, I'm taking this all in. It's funny because I grew up in the city, so I grew up always being aware of my surroundings. Me and a buddy of mine have that sixth sense. And another friend of ours never had it. In fact, unfortunately, he just passed away down in Daytona a year ago in a fire down there.
Oh, wow.
But he never had that. And when I was there and you talk about it, I just kept thinking about him. He just never had it. People came up behind him a couple times and kicked him in the face a few. He was out west, and he had a Massachusetts plate on his motorcycle. So that caused conflict out in Oklahoma. And some guys just grouped up around him. He just never saw it coming. While my other buddy had the mace in his hand and he was ready to go. So, and then the survival thing. I grew up, I know how to make shelters in all the seasons. And going to the doctors throughout the years, I've collected everything I need for my med kit, you know.
Right on.
But it's funny, I have a bag on my porch just ready to go, you know, just in case. But I've got everything in there I need. And I know all the plants up here. I know how to snare. I can make weapons, all that.
So there's a couple different theories on get home bags. Just I'll touch on quickly as you mentioned that there. So myself, we have all kinds of stuff packed in our Escalade. Okay. And my thought process is I'm only going to put in my bag what's necessary to get home or my destination. Okay. So in other words, if we're 15 miles from home, I'm not taking anything with me to build a fire or shelter or any of that stuff because I can walk 15 miles easily inside of a day. So I'm going to take just the stuff that I need to get home. And if it's during the day, then I definitely want to be well armed, those sort of things. But if it's going to say take a couple days to get home, then I will change up what would go into that bag. Now I got another buddy of mine who was a Australian spec ops guy. He's a big dude. He puts everything in his bag. His bag weighs like 90 pounds. And then he takes out of his bag what he doesn't need to get home. But myself, doesn't matter. They both work, but I would rather have everything with me and then determine what needs to go in the bag if and when I have to abandon the vehicle to get home in some manner or fashion. That's just me, but I don't want to be thinking to myself, man, I should have brought this or I should have brought that. I just want to have it all with me and then make a decision when it's time to get off the X.
Donnie, did you have something to say?
No, go ahead. No, I'm good.
Well, I know we've been going on for about an hour, but there's a couple of things I did want to hit on. I do want to go into you get a lot of behind the scenes information. I mean, your friend. I love Sean Ryan. You're friends with him, and I just you have a lot of people that give you a lot of information. So let me ask you this before I go into the FEMA and what I think about Western North Carolina, because I'm
Let her rip.
For people that have older parents, this for people that have older parents or there are that are on a tight budget, what are some things within a tight budget that we can do for those people to make them feel safer and kind of would give us a peace of mind? Is there, like, if I have an elderly parent and like I'm on a budget, they're on a budget, but I want them to be a little, but they still want their independence to live alone. Do you have anything right offhand you could suggest that could make them feel safer or that's within a reasonable budget that you could do for them to kind of keep their independence at home?
Yeah, so I would lean towards the technology side here, and you can get some stuff for a pretty reasonable price now. Ring products are pretty reasonable, but you can get Ring-like products for half the price that do the same thing. So you can check in on your parents, grandparents remotely. They can trip a button, whether it be on their phone or there's even ones that are key fobs that go with them that they just carry the key fob all the time. They press it and it immediately puts out an SOS. Basically, you can have it so it's hooked into your 911 system as well. So I would look at it like the electronic monitoring stuff, kind of the help I've fallen and can't get up, but on steroids, the modern day versions of that. Because here's the next part: you don't have a big budget. You want to make sure you have that lifeline. You can build out all this stuff in a very modular fashion. You don't have to do it all at once. You can start with one device, and then maybe as you have a little bit more disposable income, you buy the next device and keep adding on to it. It's kind of like eating an elephant. You don't have to do the whole thing all at once. And there's some very reasonably priced stuff out there.
Thank you for that. FEMA, especially after what happened in Western North Carolina. You think FEMA's going to get axed? It would not hurt my feelings.
they're either going to get axed or they're going to be transformed radically. So here's the SOP right now. And the only reason I know this because I did a course with the city of Ormond Beach, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. So the way things typically go is your SO is your op center for your county during an emergency. So your municipality, city PD, basically report into the SO and they take direction from the SO. And then the SO has, a hotline to the state level, but then the state has a hotline to the feds. And the feds have typically been the ones who are supposed to call all the shots. And if somebody below them does something that makes them look bad, then in typical fashion, they try to shut it down. Happened to some friend of ours in West North Carolina. Dr. Molly, a friend of ours at Avery Airport, was delivering medical services. She brought an entire team from Missouri, and there was all kinds of videos getting published. And this was 4 weeks after the hurricane went through. And both the county and the state showed up and said, you have until end of day today to get out of here. But there was no services for the people. So, Dr. Molly, she packed up and left, but she's teamed up with our good friend, Lieutenant Doc Pete Chambers from the Remnant Ministry in Texas. And they have several different lines of effort. So Doc Pete, Green Beret, 39 years, one of only 6 Green Berets in history to become a trauma flight surgeon. So one of them, after he left, he quit under Brandon over the injections. That's what he likes to say. I came in under Reagan and I left under Brandon. So he started one horse and his dog, and he's got a bunch of horses. He's a cowboy, patrolling the Texas border, relaying information, Texas DPS, Department of Public Safety. And this is when he started the Remnant Ministry. And then they got into interdiction for child sex trafficking. Then they got into helping people open ministries. And now his guys have had a full-time presence in North Carolina, and they will be there until everything's fixed up. You're talking helicopter pilots, spec ops soldiers that are all part of his Remnant Ministry. And so him and Doc Molly have teamed up now, and they do mobile medical care for people in West North Carolina. There's no bills, whatever donations come in through the Remnant Ministry pays for stuff as far as their supplies and whatnot. And so FEMA was highly politicized under this old Biden administration. I mean, it was John Brennan running the show. It wasn't Biden. It was John Brennan, then Obama, then Susan Rice taking the orders each day. We have the intel on all of this. General Paul Valley's a close personal friend, and him and a bunch of flag officers had the presence of mind after the 2020 election was stolen to put Obama under surveillance. And so every morning, Susan Rice would leave from her home, straight shot down to the White House. But no, she would go over here empty-handed. We've got sound and everything that was gathered by the surveillance. She would walk in the foyer, get her instructions, leave with an attaché case, then cut back down to the White House, delivering instructions on a daily basis. And we've got some firsthand stuff as far as John Brennan's concerned. Patrick Byrne is another person in our circle who was a Senate Intel Committee asset, CEO of Overstock.com. He's the guy who caught Hillary Clinton, a lot of people don't know this, taking a $20 million bribe from the Turkish government when she was Secretary of State. So Brennan gave him $18 million and said, go make this happen again, just so we've got an airtight case. And then they went to Hillary and they said, you're going to be the president for the next 8 years, but we're going to put a Bunsen burner under your ass. And we'll keep the flame nice and low as long as you're a good girl. But if you step out of line, we're going to turn the flame up. And they didn't expect the tsunami of votes for Donald Trump in 2016. You'll recall right up to the last minute, I'm not worried, 99% chance of winning.
Yeah.
So fast forward to 2020, a guy named Dennis Montgomery, who's in our circle as well, was a CIA asset for many years and wrote a piece of software called Hammer and Scorecard. You can go and research it. And the CIA used that to overthrow 83 governments around the world over the years by fixing their elections. Well, in 2020, it was used against us. And Dennis Montgomery was pissed, but more than you can imagine, that his software was used for those purposes. Where'd the 15 million votes come from, right? So you got Obama 1, Obama 2, Hillary, Biden, Kamala. All of them 65, 66, 67 million votes, but Joe Biden got 81 million. And I know where the votes came from. They came from the software hammer and scorecard. Okay. Then they disappeared again this past election. And why did it disappear? Let's just say some patriots made sure that there was no cheating going on at that level in 2024. So at the end of the day, John Brennan is at the center of all of this stuff. John Brennan is the bridge between our federal government and the Rockefellers and Klaus Schwab and the WEF and so on and so forth. I'm not sure how we got down this rabbit hole. It's a very, very deep rabbit hole, but I'll reel it back in again by saying,
FEMA.
Yeah, by coming back to FEMA. So I think what will happen is the management part of that acronym will be returned to the states. So FEMA, if they continue to exist, it will be in a small supplementary role to bring in whatever assets they may have at their disposal, like trailers, those sort of things. And they sure as heck hadn't done a good job in North Carolina because they politicized the whole thing. It was all Trump voters. So there was no way that the Biden admin was going to pay to do anything for Trump voters. As a matter of fact, they wanted to, basically try and prevent those people from voting as best as they could. There's a whole other discussion around utilizing a certain technology for intensifying storms that our government has patented, has over 100 patents on. I won't go down because you'll get a strike because we've got the strikes before for this particular topic. But what I will say is if FEMA continues to exist, it will be a smaller organization that does nothing but distribute resources, and the state will be in control of what happens inside their borders.
Do you think that is, to me, that's probably the best, even though it was tragic, but I think what has come to life through Hawaii, even California now, Western North Carolina, to Florida, the community has stepped up. We forgot to how to rely on the community and help each other as a community, and you've started seeing more of that. So there was a blessing into that we are still, the American people. There comes a time when we don't care about your politics. We don't, care about what flag you have in your house. You've lost everything. You're suffering. We, the American people, your neighbors will step up. People you don't know will take time off of their job and they will come into your community and they will help you. And one of the worst things you can see, and I've experienced this in law enforcement, especially water. I've seen in Princeville, North Carolina, where the levee broke and a whole mobile home park. And it seems like it's mostly lower income that are on the levees, and where the whole mobile home park was wiped out. And we were called in, for martial law to prevent the looting and stuff. And that's the first time in my life I've heard the sound of silence at when a natural disaster comes in and it kills every living thing, and you stand out there. There's no lights. There's nothing out there but you and the dirt that you're standing on, because even the pavement's covered with dirt. Houses are ripped off their foundations. We were in third floor apartments seeing turtles and snakes and water moccasins, and you hear nothing. Silence. And it's the most eerie, unnatural. But as first responders, we were able to leave and after a month and go home. They were left in that. And I think seeing what we have went through, and this isn't really a political statement, but I think Americans learned to depend on America.
Mm-hmm.
And we have gotten back to our roots to help our neighbors. And, you had people driving 500 miles to bring them barbecue sandwiches or water, and I think that's where we need to go back to. Do you have an opinion on that or experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, I've been through some, major calamities in my life. Many of them weather related. We're Hurricane Central here in Florida, and one of the life lessons I've learned is no matter how bad the situation is, you always walk away with new knowledge that you didn't have before. And you might not realize it right away. It might be years before you realize it, but you always walk away with additional knowledge, number one. Number two, we preach to people to talk to their neighbors, because somewhere along the line that stopped, right? People aren't as friendly with their neighbors anymore. And so if there was a problem in your community or your locality and you don't even talk to your neighbors, you're not very well prepared. So we preach the concept of what are called MAGs, MAG, mutual assistance groups, and getting to know who's in your neighborhood. What do they have as far as skills are concerned? And if things got really bad, what's the plan? How do we get in touch with each other? Who's bringing what skill to the table that can do this thing, that thing? Like, we have a guy in our group who's a surgeon. He's done surgery on me. He's an MD in addition to being a surgeon. And that's a skill you just can't easily replace, right? And some people are pretty hardcore these days. They're like, well, if somebody doesn't bring something to the table, we don't want them in our group. And I think that's very anti-American, anti-Christian, to be quite frank. And whether people are secular, atheist, agnostic, whatever, this country was founded on Christian values, whether people want to call themselves Christians or not at the end of the day. And I can tell you that from firsthand experience, because we developed this 5-step process where we would go through a series of workshops with our clients, again, Fortune 1000 companies, trying to discover what is the core DNA, like what is the purpose of this organization, what are their core values, beliefs, all of these things. And when we got to the end of that, there were many times we would hand them the stuff and say, okay, well, we wish you the best luck. And they'd be like, no, what's the next step? And we'd be like, yeah, we're not the company for you, because we don't share the same values. We look at the world through different values. I'm not saying I'm right and you're wrong, but we're not compatible. So we're just going to, wish you the best of luck. But here's the thing. In those types of companies, we would give them a list of over 100 values, and like clockwork, every single one of them, didn't matter where they fell on the political spectrum, where they fell on the religious spectrum, they espoused values as American values that are Christian values. They may not realize it. Many of them didn't realize it, but that was the source of their values and belief system. So we've done a terrible job of maintaining sense of community, and because of these crappy things, like I despise these things. And as a tech guy, I know that sounds funny, but I hate them. I absolutely hate them. And my wife, she used to have like all the notifications. Now she's in the same deal as me. She's got all turned off, except for the most important stuff. I don't know how people do it with their phone, ding, 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 going off. How do you get anything done? But anyway, at the end of the day, we counsel people: meet your neighbors, talk to your neighbors. Make sure that as a community you have some semblance of a plan if bad things happen, and it's the old adage, right? If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. It's that simple,
Right. I'm lucky that way. I live in a small town and a lot of farming. We got beef cattle, chickens, and everyone would take care of everyone up here,
Exactly.
Horses, there's horses around, There was a town in northern Maine probably 10 years ago that went on its own. It just cut all ties. The only thing they had coming to the town was gas and diesel. And the ripple effect started. The stores around the area weren't selling anything because everyone was providing for everyone. Everyone was bartering with the town next to them, for eggs, beef, whatever. And they shut it down. The state said, nope, stop right now. They saw the ripple effect going out and spreading.
Parallel economy.
Yeah. Right.
That's another thing that we preach to people too. Like, if the shit was going to hit the fan, we're not drinkers, we don't smoke or anything like that. But those vices in some sort of economic calamity or natural disaster, people will do anything for their cigarettes and their alcohol. So good barter items in that alternative economy.
Chris, where do you think we go wrong as a society with our youth? Do you think it's that we don't get them outdoors enough? Do you think that it's because both parents are having to work now? Or what's the one thing in your experience?
the biggest, let's call it detractor, the biggest threat that we face in America is the poisoning of our food supply. And I've been preaching this for many, many years. So if you look at Native Americans, for example, 50% of their diet at a minimum was fat, and there were virtually no carbohydrates, right? So when you eat carbohydrates, there's high glycemic value, there's low glycemic value. Low glycemic value doesn't spike your blood sugar like high glycemic value does. But when you're burning carbohydrates and it's turning into basically glycogen, when that level falls off, your blood sugar level falls off, then you have to eat again to bring it back up again. So that's why people have these spikes and crashes, right? So in the 1980s, we're all old enough to remember the war on fat, right? We got to take the fat out of everything. When you take good fat out of food, it tastes like crap. So what they did, and they did it by design, they put copious amounts of sugar in food to make it taste better. Sugar is processed the exact same way as cocaine. It lights up the cerebral cortex the exact same way as cocaine. It's insanely addictive, and it causes your blood sugar goes up, but then it falls off a cliff. What do you have to do when it falls off a cliff? You have to eat to make it go back up again. So RFK this week said that 76% of Americans are obese. Now, the numbers I've heard and seen recently aren't quite that bad. It's more like 40% obese and 36% overweight. But either way, it doesn't matter how you slice it. The poisoning of our food system has meant that, in conjunction with other things, kids stay at home, they fart around on their phones, they play video games, they don't go outside for activities. And so it's a vicious circle, right? So we've had to dramatically lower our physical test standards for military. We've got a crisis there. So much so that my buddy, Lieutenant Colonel Doc Pete Chambers, he was born in 1965. I was born in 1969. And he said, if things were to get really bad, like if we were to have kinetic warfare, which is entirely possible these days in America, that those of us with some gray in our beards are going to have to step up to the plate. And, I'm not trying to scare anybody, but we've had intelligence for many, many years. Number one, Sean Ryan and I have a bunch of mutual acquaintances, but I'm not friends with Sean Ryan per se, but lots of other people in the same circle. But we started getting intelligence in the 90s that Hezbollah in particular, Hezbollah Unit 910, had about 300 cells in America. And those cells could have had anywhere from, say, 2 or 3 people to 50 people in them, okay? And so Hezbollah Unit 910 is self-funded, whereas Hezbollah in the Middle East is funded by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, okay? So Hezbollah got joined at the hip with the cartels in the early 1990s. One, because the enemy of my enemy is a friend of mine, but 2, because of money-making opportunity, okay? So the Chinese send all these precursors into Mexico for multiple drugs, including fentanyl. They have very rudimentary labs for making the fentanyl. And Hezbollah has been embedded for so long now, they look and sound just like the cartel members do. You can't tell the difference between them. My buddy Doc Pete was the one who broke the intel of the 9 man pads that came across our southern border just before the election. So these are shoulder-mounted surface-to-air missiles. They're small, though, like they're 1.5 pound payload, but they're meant to take out the engines of a jet plane either when it's landing or taking off. If you were to take out like one engine on a commercial airliner, it wouldn't crash. You'd have to take out at least 2 of them, sort of thing. But Doc Pete was the one who broke that. The pictures, which have not been released, but I have seen them, and they went straight to Trump, by the way, as soon as it happened. That's when Trump started flying different planes. There were known Hezbollah terrorists and Sinaloa cartel members. And there were 2 other parties that I'm not at liberty to say who they were. That was pretty shocking. And when it comes out, it's going to rock a bunch of people's worlds. But suffice it to say that we now have thousands of terrorist cells here that we know of. And it's not just Hezbollah, it's other groups as well, but they would be the most prominent one of them all. So Al-Qaeda's now seen a resurgence. As a result of that, ISIS has seen a resurgence. ISIS is just a branch of Al-Qaeda. We just got intel a couple days ago that there's been some alerts of some South American gangs that are apparently joined at the hip with AQ, which is short for Al Qaeda. So we've known for about 20 years that there's a high probability of what's called swarm attacks happening in America. And I'll give you the Cliff Notes version, but imagine in your community, Don, how many people live in your county, for example?
The county, I'm not sure, but like my town's almost 1,000.
Would it be safe to say that your county is under 200,000?
Oh yeah, probably
Possibly.
more like 50.
Okay. All right. How many schools would you say you all have in your county? Just off the top of your head, a dozen?
Yeah, say 15.
Okay. So imagine this scenario happening across America in small counties like yours, where a dozen Hezbollah cells attack a dozen schools simultaneously. Now, Victoria would know this, even with mutual aid, which is where you're calling for assistance from people outside your county, law enforcement outside your county. They would not be able to respond to all 12 school attacks, probably one. Okay. So you have this dozen terror cells, and they know they're going to lose one. Okay. So they've wreaked havoc in your county today. And tomorrow, and this is happening across the country, tomorrow they go to another small county and they attack 11. And again, with mutual aid, they can still only respond to one. So the next day, they still have 10 cells. They attack 10 schools. So when the JTTF is war game this out with the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which is the feds all the way down to local PD, by day 3, nobody's sending their kids to school and nobody's going to work, and the economy implodes, society implodes, things go off the rails. You end up what's called a WROL situation, world without rule of law. And so number one, the concept of swarm attacks is what I described first. Okay. So we're hitting all these areas with, dozens of attacks simultaneously coast to coast. Then you roll in one day after the next day after the next day. That's how you paralyze everybody. And then we go to the next thing. Okay. So we have 55,000 substations in the country that are part of our 3 grids. We have 3 separate electric grids. We have East, West, and Texas. So, for example, a couple summers ago, California ran out of energy. Texas temporarily connected to the West grid, sent them some power. When it was done, they disconnected. All right. Out of those 55,000 substations, 9 of them are choke points, 3 per grid. If you take those 9 substations out, you knock out power to 95% of America. In other words, the only people who would still have power would have to be so close to the power station that there were no substations in between them. Okay. When Trump left office, it was about an 18-month lead time to get transformers. We do not have any in stock. We do not build them. They come from Germany, South Korea, and other places. Okay. Right now it's 48 months to get them. So go back to the swarm attack. Okay. We have swarm attacks happening today across the country. Then we have swarm attacks tomorrow. Then we have swarm attacks the next day. Okay. The very next day, the data and all the comms lines and the grid are taken down by our enemies. Trivial to do. For years, both parties, and I've been saying for 30 years, Democrats, Republicans, 2 different sides of the same coin, you could harden our grid against this stuff for about $5 billion. So a fraction of what we sent to Ukraine, right? And all these USAID wasting money, etc. Mm-hmm. So they won't do that immediately, though. So our from a logical perspective, meaning across the network, all of our big infrastructure has been compromised by the Chinese, the Koreans, and the Iranians in particular. Again, they won't take that down until word spreads of just how much damage they've done to us. All right. So then let me add something else to your calculus on this. We were the very first ones, and this started 2 years ago, and people made fun of us, and we've been vindicated. We're almost at 400 episodes of Survival Dispatch News, and it used to be once a week. Now it's 7 days a week. But anyway, in 2019, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard launched an attack against the primary Saudi Arabian oil refinery. Okay. And the attack that they launched, they use a piece of software out of Hollywood called Drone Swarm. And what that was at the time was one operator could control 5,000 drones simultaneously to conduct light shows. Okay. So they used the same technology, and they sent 24 drones to this Saudi Arabian oil refinery, and inside of 20 minutes, they knocked out 5% of the world's oil production. This is 2019. You can look it up, okay? So fast forward to about a year and a half ago, you have the 10/7 event in Gaza, and 2 weeks after that, somebody flew a decent-sized DJI drone into the Cleveland Browns stadium. You can look it up. It was a Thursday night football game. So imagine, like, if you had seen paragliders coming in with guys with machine guns, people would have, been in tune to that because of what just happened in Gaza, right? But what happened in Cleveland was everybody stood around watching this drone come in, okay? And we had already been stating, again, over 2 years ago. Let me back up and give you another real world example, and I'll stitch the whole thing together. Early 2000s, Chechen rebels seized a theater in downtown Moscow. It had about 950 people in it, 980 people, whatever it was. Well, the FSB, which is the Russian equivalent to the FBI, they don't look at the things the way we do, right? So if we had a situation like that where you have almost 1,000 people, including terrorists, in a building, okay, and one life was lost, people would freak out and say that our law enforcement did a bad job. The FSB doesn't work that way. If half the people die, whatever. We ended this situation, okay? So without telling any of the first responders or anybody below the FSB, they pumped aerosolized carfentanil and remifentanil into the HVAC system in that theater, okay? There are 1,400 analogs of fentanyl. We only have signatures on 200 of them. And just for example, carfentanil is 50 times more deadly than the base analog of fentanyl is. So now you take this, you aerosolize it, you pump it through the HVAC system. It killed about a third of the people inside. And because the first responders were not told that it was being used, those people died. They could have been easily been saved with Narcan, okay? And just here, you want to talk about something for your get home bag, by the way, that's free. Go to nextdistro.org. It's a government website, nextdistro.org. Pick your state. It will connect you to the Department of Health for your state. Plug in your information into the form. They will send you 2 boxes of Narcan that have 2 doses each. It usually takes 2 doses to save somebody as a minimum, okay? And put those in your get home bag. What you don't want to do is go to your doctor and have them write a script for it. Any pharmacy will fill it for free. I made that mistake years ago, and it's almost impossible for me now to get life insurance because they see Narcan on my profile and they think I'm a drug addict and that I need Narcan to save myself, right? But nextdistro.org, they'll send it to you for free. When we did it here in Florida, we filled the form in on a Sunday and we had the Narcan on Tuesday for free and not on our medical records, okay? So that being said,
yeah, my doctor passes them out. I have 4 with me right now.
Smart these days. So here's where I'm going with all of this, okay? Take the attack on that Russian theater, take the attack on the Saudi Arabians. Now imagine an operator, 50, 100 drones. By the way, that software now can, one operator can control 15,000 drones. But just imagine 50 or 100 drones fly into an open air venue, a concert, football game, and they spray aerosolized fentanyl over the crowd. Tens of thousands of people will die from the fentanyl, and tens of thousands of people will die because they get trampled, they have heart attacks, all that kind of stuff, all right? Next distro, nextdistro.org, nextdistro.org. So here's the next thing. The Russians took anthrax years ago, and when you hit anthrax, which is biological, right? When you hit it with an antibiotic, you'll never kill more than about 95, 96%. So they got a petri dish and they hit it with the first antibiotic and 4% survive. So they take the 4% from that and they put it in the next petri dish and they culture it so they get a good sampling again, and they hit it with the next antibiotic, and then the next, and eventually you end up with an antibiotic resistant anthrax. As soon as you show the first signs of anthrax poisoning, you're dead. You will not live. That doesn't matter. There's no saving you at that point in time as soon as the symptoms happen. So instead of fentanyl, let's say it's aerosolized anthrax, which has been used in multiple venues, right? So to put all this together, you got swarm attacks happening at public buildings, schools, could be retail outlets. There was some intel not too long ago saying that there was some Somali terrorists who wanted to attack multiple Best Buys on a Black Friday coast to coast. But you've got all that happening. You've got drones now flying, which are almost impossible to shoot down, right? So my youngest son was supposed to book out to South Korea in 5 days. His orders got changed today. He's been training 5-man squads in Fort Benning on what to do if you encounter an FPV drone, right? So first person view. So we're not talking predators, ISR drones that are 10,000 feet high, right? Intelligence, surveillance, recon. You're talking small drones in your face. If you've been bird hunting before, you ain't going to shoot down an FPV drone. So we're so unsophisticated right now. The protocol for our troops: throw down a smoke grenade. Okay, well, they have thermal cameras so they can see your heat signature. So what's the backup to that? Try shoot it down with your M4 duty rifle. Good luck with that. A 5.56 rifle against a small drone, and you've seen what's happened in Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
So again, you don't need a lot of money to outfit these drones with things like aerosolized fentanyl, aerosolized anthrax. They've got them now where they shoot steel ball bearings up to about a 2-acre footprint and kill everybody in that 2 acres. And again, you don't need a whole lot of money to do this stuff, and you don't need a lot of sophistication to do this stuff. And here's the next thing: you don't even need to have radio frequencies anymore. So people would say, well, you just block the radio frequencies and the drones will either crash or they'll do an ET and they'll fly home, right? Well, when Gaza happened, and Admiral Robert Harward, you can look him up. He's the first SEAL ever to become an admiral. He was a good friend of mine. He was Don Mann's mentor. His father ran Project Gyrodyne in the late 1950s when we were concerned about Soviet subs off our East Coast, right? And so, believe it or not, we had remote control helicopters in the 1950s that were armed with torpedoes that had a 42-mile range to go hunt those subs. And that was kind of the beginning of air-based drones. We had some land-based drones before that. So he said to me, he consults for all kinds of different defense contractors. This was going back maybe, let's say like 8-9 months ago, that the Israelis were using our drone technology to map out the tunnels in Gaza. No RF, no radio frequencies, 100% AI controlled drones. Those drones had two purposes: map out the tunnels and kill Hamas. Well, one of them, you may have heard this in the news, it popped up out of the ground and there was a van full of UN observers and it killed everybody because it couldn't differentiate. It thought they were Hamas. So we now have AI drones that don't cost a lot of money, that you can block the RF all you want. You can block GPS, for crying out loud. They don't need it, and they can still fly and they can still attack. So again, just to stitch this whole thing together, we end up with swarm attacks, multiple locations, with terrorist cells. Some of those swarm attacks involve drones, which are low dollar, and one guy's controlling a whole bunch of drones, and you don't know who he is or where he is. Like, you don't even know where the battle line is because you don't know where this guy is that's controlling it. Okay. We do this for several days. AQ has said they want to kill a minimum of 50,000 people in their next attack, 50,000 Americans. And they've been saying that for many years. And that's a lot of this intel is open source. It's easily verifiable. But again, now we get to the point where they take the electric grid down and put us into the 1800s. You can't rebuild the grid because you don't have friggin' transformers. There's very few transmission lines in the country that can handle 700 kV. So they hack into a system and they send 700 kV down a 200 kV transmission line, which is a standard size power line. It melts the whole freaking thing, and the next substation goes down, and it's like dominoes going down. So now you have no comms, you have no electricity, you've got nobody working, the economy's ground to a halt. And here's the final piece to it: we are never more than 3 missed meals away from anarchy. Okay. So remember how I started by telling you we built this real-time ERP system, enterprise resource planning system, way back in the day for lumberyards. Every single grocery store these days has ERP systems that are now called like 3, 4, 5 PL systems. So third-party logistics. So what that means is stock for this item drops below a certain threshold, the system automatically cuts a PO to the distributor. It notifies accounting. It sends a bill of lading to the logistics company. It coordinates it with other deliveries, and the distributor can log into your system. The logistics company can log into your system. That's why they're called, third party logistics. And basically, all the food is gone in a matter of days, like 1 day to 3 days. There's no food left, and now you have people who haven't prepped and they don't have any food. How many times have you seen somebody beat the tar out of somebody for a TV on Black Friday? What are they going to do when that's food, when there's no food available? So you're talking the complete and utter devolution of American society. God forbid that we ever get to this point. So again, we're not doomsday preppers. I'm not sitting here telling you and your audience, be prepared for this. What I'm saying is be prepared for the thing that's most likely to happen in your area. So I don't know your area of the country near as well as the Southeast, but I have done some work in Portland for Sun, as well as New Hampshire, Vermont areas. I would say you should probably be prepared for extended grid down because of snowstorms and ice storms and things like that. I think back to early 2000s or late 90s, there was some big ice storm that took everybody down in the Northeast for an extended period of time. Well, here's the thing. If you're prepared for that ice storm in the Northeast, all right, and Victoria and the rest of us down here in the Southeast, we're prepared for hurricanes. And you go back to my home state of Texas, where we're prepared for tornadoes and crazy hailstorms and so on and so forth. If we are prepared for those things that are the most likely to happen things, God forbid, but if it's an order of magnitude greater than that, we have what we need. Okay. We've stacked up food. We've stacked up water. I'm telling you right now, when Hurricane Matthew hit us, and 2015, 2016, whatever it was, we had no power for about a week. It sucks not having power in Florida heat, but whatever. But we had a sewer main burst next to a water main. We had no water for 3 weeks, and everybody around us had water. So I still had to go to meetings. I had to, it creates logistical problems. How do you flush the toilet when you have no water? Let alone have a shower. And I'm telling you, without water, it's brutal. Yeah, if you go to survivaldispatch.com, click on the connect menu up top, we give away a bunch of ebooks. So we have one that's a home defense plan, because everybody's home layout and everybody's priorities are different. Like if you don't have kids and you don't have a split plan with kids on the other end of the house, for example, just to quickly touch on that, you never ever go after a home intruder in that scenario. He doesn't know your house. You do. In our particular case, my wife and the dogs will be in the bathtub in the master bathroom, and I have a perfect hiding spot that somebody walks through that door, they're going to be a victim of high-speed lead poisoning, just like that. And so that we've got several ebooks that are for free that you can download from our website. And thanks, Diane. Appreciate you following us. But at the end of the day, that was a deep, deep rabbit hole, but that's kind of, best case scenario, nothing happens. Worst case scenario, it's a natural disaster. Worst case scenario, widespread swarm attacks, grid down, and all the crap that goes with that.
I have one question for you up here, but Moore County, North Carolina, they tried to take out the power grid, and that's right outside of Fort Bragg. That tells you what you need to know, folks. That tells you what you need to know. But Southern Belle Bigfoot, well, I'm prepared. I'm gonna hold on for your answer, buddy, because you're high speed low drag. She says, who would be so filled with hate that they would want to harm 50,000 people? I'm holding on for this one. Just go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, these are radical Muslim terrorists. I'm not saying that all Muslim people are bad.
No.
Yep, 82nd Airborne, and by the way, everything's getting renamed. Fort Bragg, Fort Benning, we're all getting our proper names back, by the way. Pete Hegseth committed to that. And Pete and I, we have a whole bunch of mutual contacts, but that's another rabbit hole. So here's the deal, is that Woodrow Wilson, 1913, was kind of the advent of, call it whatever you want to call it. Some people call it the Committee of 300, the NWO, the globalists, whatever you want to call them, basically started to take control of countries around the world, governments around the world. And, that now includes things like Klaus Schwab's World Economic Forum, where they brag about having, their young global leaders installed in governments around the world, especially Western governments. So the CIA has not done us any favors. And we have a guy on Survival Dispatch, good friend of mine, Jeff MD, CIA operative for 26 years, and he hates what the CIA has turned into. But they have done all these shady things around the world, including the Middle East, and they've created a whole lot of hate towards America, which on the one hand is justified based on how bad these bad things the CIA has done, but is not deserving of the rest of us as Americans. I'm a firm believer, no matter where you go in the world, there are far more good people than bad people. And that, do we really think that everybody in Iraq was a bad person in Baghdad? Absolutely not. I have all kinds of friends who served over there that said they were just normal people like us. They say you had this dictatorial government and terrorists running the show, and that's the bad guys. Well, unfortunately, we have pissed off so many people around the world because of nation building, stealing elections, doing all these shady things through the CIA in particular, that these groups absolutely hate our guts. And, that's their goals. Their minimum goal is 50,000 Americans dead, 50 to 60,000 Americans dead. If something were to unfold like I described, you are no longer talking 50 to 60,000. As a matter of fact, if the grid goes down for an extended period of time, within 6 months, 90% of Americans will be dead, according to the JTTF.
Wow.
Yeah. Incredible. Horrible, horrible stuff. You're on mute, Don.
Oh, sorry. I made my parents stock up on rice, beans, and they have access to water, But
Good
yeah,
move.
But
I don't know if you know a guy named Ben Davidson, Space Weather News.
Oh, yeah. I don't know him, but yeah, I've watched his stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've been following him for a while, and a natural disaster could do the same thing. I mean, a solar flare took out the whole Northeast up here one year. So
if you got time for a couple minutes, I'll give you some tidbits on that. So September 1859, September 1st, 1859 was the Carrington.
Yeah.
And so this is plasma ejected by the sun. It usually hits Earth once every 100 years. We're way overdue for what's called an X5 or above, which is the level of an EMP pulse, essentially. Okay. Right. So here's the thing. If you get hit with that type of energy, it smokes the entire world because it hits our ionosphere and goes around the world. So it's not like it hits one side of the Earth and the other side is not affected. The whole Earth is affected. It can actually flip your North and South Pole, do all sorts of crazy stuff. Okay. So a Carrington level event, if it were to happen today, well over 90% of people would be dead in the first matter of hours. And it's a question as to whether or not humanity would survive much more before that, because when we had it in 1859, all we had really were like telegraph lines. It set the telegraph lines on fire, the telegraph machines, the telegraph operators, but we have so much infrastructure now that unfathomable. And there, historically, we can see over history that there was as high as what's called an X9. An X9 would obliterate the planet. There'd be nothing left. So,
right. Yeah, we had 10 solar flares in the 80s that would fry the wires right off the lines today.
Mm-hmm.
And we've lost almost 30% of our shield too. So,
correct. Yeah, EMPs are crazy. So here's a quick shout out for our friends at empshield.com. And you can check this out on our website, by the way. So basically, electricity will always take the shortest path to ground. Okay. So when this electromagnetic pulse, for example, hits your house, it's going to destroy everything inside of your home, trying to ground itself out. Okay. Like anything with a circuit board, anything electronic is toast. Okay.
Yeah. Batteries.
So this is crazy. So EMP Shield, there's a I'm trying to think, like a compound that basically has infinite resistance until it's hit by electricity, and then it has infinite attraction. And this is way above my pay grade. I'm trying to explain as best as I can. But we are the only people out there, period, bar none, that has ever conducted an EMP test like this. And so we threw 400,000 volts with a Marks generator. We built a Marks generator, which almost killed one of my guys. And so essentially, it would cost you tens of thousands of dollars to have a meter that's capable of measuring 400,000 volts. Okay. So instead of that, for every centimeter that electricity can hop from one wire to another, so there's 1 centimeter, is 30,000 volts. Okay. So we took wires and we spread them apart like this wide. You can see it in the video. And we had 20,000 volt capacitors. Okay. And we hit each one of them with a 20,000 volt transformer. And so 400,000 volts. Okay. And we jumped the electricity across this gap. So it doesn't matter what anybody wants to say. There's no bullshit. It was 400,000 volts. You can't jump that big of a gap. Okay. This is so crazy. So Steve, who, one of my master electricians, builds a test bed. Okay. So we have a simulated power source coming in. We have a ground rod. We have a panel. We have an EMP shield device. And this is where it gets really crazy. Then you have this test bed of sensitive electronics, LED controllers, furnace controller, all this stuff. We took the EMP shield, we put it 6 inches away from the controllers. 6 inches. Normally it's over at the panel there, okay? And we hit that sucker with 400,000 volts repeatedly. And every single device survived because, remember, this metal oxide varistor is the component that's inside, has infinite attraction. As soon as that electricity hit the stuff, even though it hit closer to the electronics than the EMP shield, because it draws the electricity to it to take it to a dedicated ground, it saved everything. We took the EMP shield off and it smoked everything on the test bed. It smoked a camera on a tripod 20 feet away. It smoked his refrigerator up a level and over to the other side of the house because it arced in through the sheetrock to the house wiring. So this is where it gets really crazy. So we thought, okay, a Carrington level event would bring something in the order of a 900 kV, 900,000 volt electrical pulse. Okay. So we're thinking, man, how do we build that? All right. So we've already invested the money. We've built this 20,000 volt capacitor system, Marks generator. So what we'll do is we'll build another one beside it, and that'll get us to 800,000. We'll test that. And then the plan was we would build a third one beside it to get us to 1.2 million volts to say, look, EMP shield works. We hit it with 1.2 million volts, more than a Carrington level event. We got to 800,000 volts. Steve is 25 feet away from the on switch with a fiberglass rod, standing on a truck tire, no wheel in the middle of it, no rim. And he flicked the switch and he electrocuted himself. That 800,000 volts arced 25 feet and tried to ground itself through him. So we were like, okay, we can't do this because we're probably going to take out every single one of his neighbors' houses with this thing. So the plan that we have is we're going to build a 1.2 million volt Tesla power coil. So it's wicked expensive. And it'll probably be sometime this year in 2025 that we do it. But all of the naysayers had nothing to say. Like if they came along and said, well, EMP shield doesn't work. Okay, well, where's your video? Here's our video. And if at the top of survivaldispatch.com, we put down 360,000 volts just to placate anybody who was concerned about the distance. We know it was 20 times 20, it was 400,000 volts, whatever. And it passed with flying colors. So if you're worried about an EMP, get an EMP shield device. And if you go to our website, we've got a code. I can't remember what it is, but it's on there, Survival Dispatch 10 or Survival 10. You get $50 off. They're only a few $100 and they work. They really, really work. So anyway.
Oh, good.
Your live chats are very informative. I wanted to hit on that because we've been going on 2 hours, and I know you've got your wife and your dogs, and you run. You work 24/7, literally. And I know family is important. especially with your fur babies. And sounds like you have a very dedicated and supportive wife. I think that's outstanding.
Very much.
Uh, the one thing I would like to hit on that I don't hear, I hear it touched on some, but I guess being my background with explosives and the canines and a lot, I was given a lot of when we used to troubleshoot the dogs. I was taken under a lot of people in Fort Bragg gave me a lot of training that I probably
Cool.
shouldn't. They really took care of me. But secondary targets. When it hits the fan and we see our something happen in the public, um, people don't hit on secondary targets a lot. I think I've heard you talk about them before your live chats. I believe it was you. Secondary targets when you have an open shooter event, when you have explosives events, when you have chemical attacks. The fentanyl thing, I always say, I said they're going to put it in the water. But can you hit on secondary devices, secondary targets? Because I believe when you were talking a while ago how 10 schools could get hit or 10 sporting events could get hit. 911's overwhelmed. You're not going to get that. I mean, you're going to get that one area that after that first attack, 911's overwhelmed, which is why it's good to have a CB. I mean, um, but people don't talk about secondary targets. When you go in to help your friends, when you go in to stop the bleeding, your instinct is to help the people you love. You running into those crowds. We're all good by nature. I believe most of us are good
Agree.
by nature.
I agree.
We don't think about secondary targets. That's where they get their numbers.
Yeah. So this actually, you have to go back to your situational awareness. Okay. So I'll give you like a big example, small example. So a small example would be, let's say we go out to dinner and we're in a busy restaurant. I worked as a doorman as a side gig, not because I needed the money, but because when you work as a doorman in a rock and roll bar and you're not drinking, you meet a lot of women that way. This was back in the day because you're not I'm not some drunk there, right? But I got in a lot of fights over that 7 years and got to the point where even back then, if I was going out in public, I'd sit with my back against the wall. I could see everybody who's coming in and out. I know what my exits are, paying attention, right? Situational awareness. So that's a small, simple type of example. But let me give you something a little bit more robust that speaks to your concern. So there's a guy named Mike Shelby. He was an NCO intel officer. Forward Observer is one of his companies based out of Texas. And he does a lot of online training, but this is kind of interesting, just ironic. He does a lot of in-person training in North Carolina, even though he's based out of Texas. And you can look up his schedule, but he has both a course as well as a book and a handbook for doing what's called a local area study. So let me give you an example. It's not unusual for an intersection to be closed for whatever reason, and for a driver to say to the officer, could you please let me through? Like, I live on the other side over there. And the officer says, no, like, it's closed. And the person turns around and says, well, I don't know how to get home, sort of thing. Now, not as much now that we have maps on our phones, but that was a pretty common thing in the past where people for X amount of years been driving the same way to and from work, the same way to and from the grocery, et cetera, and never come up with any of this other stuff. So a local area study gives you a purview of all of the assets that are in your immediate area. Where's the retention pond? Where's their water? Where are some places that you could particularly, where you could find food where most people wouldn't go looking for it. And I'm not doing it justice. That the local area study is worth its weight in gold. What you could discover exists in your neighborhood, for example, could be everything from, registered sex offenders to resources and all these things on down the line, where there might be somebody that's, perhaps of the same, cut from the same cloth that you could count on, that you could team up with, What do you do if cars can't get through? What's going to be the safest, easiest way to get back home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So where I'm going with all of that is if you don't have that intelligence on your area and the shit hits the fan and you've got elevated heart rate, you're not thinking clearly, you're not going to make the best decisions, just the way it is, right? So, but if you have this local area plan, this local area study that you've done, you will have a plan. You will know what to do. And so, as far as secondary targets are concerned, really what I'm driving at here is distance equals safety at the end of the day. So, basically, you got to get away from where all the action is as fast as possible. And if you don't have that local area study, you don't necessarily know what your best options are. And let me give you a great example. Terrorist attack, whatever, a building, a stadium, whatever the case may be. And this has happened multiple times over the years in the Middle East in particular. And they hang out at the exits. And as people come out the doors, they just mow them down. It's happened at Christian churches in the Middle East where these terrorists have slaughtered people in that way. So, I mean, that's another example. Keith Graves is a good friend of mine. He was a law enforcement officer, 30 years, Bay Area, basically the worst of the worst in California. He likes to say how he retired 4 years ago and moved to America. He lives in Idaho now. But his stuff is Christian warrior training. He gives away all sorts of training online, and he does a lot of training for church security teams. And he's a walking book of knowledge on this stuff. But that's a concern right there. So a church gets attacked, people disperse, they go out the main entrance and they get mowed down. We've seen it happen elsewhere. So to think it couldn't happen here is, not accurate. So having alternative exits, places, I'm not a big fan of this run, duck, and hide thing. I think of the bar in Orlando that got hit, Pulse nightclub, and they all ran to the restrooms, and they was like shooting fish in a barrel, right? The bad guy came in and shot them all. They couldn't defend themselves because technically you're not allowed to take a gun into a place that serves alcohol in Florida, and they had no means of escape. It was clearly something that your average person is not thinking, well, I'm going to this nightclub, I should probably have an emergency plan. But anybody, who works in our industry, law enforcement, military, it's the first thing we do. We walk into a building, we think, okay, if a fire happens, if somebody comes in shooting, what are our options? Where do we go? And so I'll give you another little piece here. If you're an alpha man and you give a shit about your family and your wife and everybody else who's with your party, you need to have a code word and you need to have a plan. A good word is simple, one word: avalanche. So if I say avalanche, that means that my wife is to exit a completely different way than I'm going to exit. It means that I'm fixing to pull my gun and I'm going to draw a fire so that whoever's with my party can get out of Dodge, and there's no discussion over it. It's not like, well, what do you mean? What's going on? Tell us what the plan is. No, as soon as the word avalanche is uttered, I'm going that way and you guys are going the opposite direction so you guys can get to safety. And you said it earlier, Victoria, concealment and cover, right? So concealment, you can still get shot behind it. Cover, hopefully you won't get shot behind unless somebody's, throwing 50 BMGs your way or something like that. But I'm not thinking so much in maybe the same context as you, but I'm thinking of you becoming the secondary target, really, is what it boils down to. That's what you have to plan for, is if you're the secondary target, what are your options? And that's basically that's a Cliff Notes version.
I think you knocked it out the ballpark. Well, we've had you well over 2 hours. So I want to thank everyone that stuck it out and respect you've shown it. Chat. I know you got a few subscribers tonight, Chris. I love your live shows, but I love all of the videos that come out. They're very informative, and you never know when, like the lady at the gas station, when it's going to come full circle. And you probably don't realize it, but you have probably saved a lot of lives. I think you do realize it. At the end of each show, I try to give the guest a few minutes to acknowledge somebody that's had an impact in your life. It could be your wife standing by you all those years. It could be anyone. I want to give you the floor for a few moments. If you have anyone in mind, it could be anyone. If you want to acknowledge the world, you're welcome to. Then we're going to sign off, and just stay on for 5 minutes after we
Sure.
sign off. And I have really enjoyed you stepping out of your normal platform and coming on our platform and opening the doors and giving us some education. I think you rock. You always have a seat at our table,
I appreciate it.
and I really appreciate you coming on. Don, anything you want to say important?
No, I just want to say everything you talked about was right up my alley.
Awesome.
It's ever since I was a kid, everything you said, same, almost parallel what you were talking about. But no, very informative night. I think helped a lot of people. I think you have to be prepared, and the panic thing is something you really got to be ready for. You know,
Yeah.
but
So,
but
I
go
mean,
ahead.
as far as people are concerned, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for my wife. At the end of the day, I wouldn't have never survived that night. Uh, when I had I actually don't even know if I managed to spit it all out. What happened there? But what happened that night that I got rushed to the hospital and they gave up on me is I had bilateral pulmonary embolisms. So that's blood clots in both lungs. Blood clots are the number one cause of deaths in hospital, accounts for about 1 in 4 deaths. And bilateral pulmonary embolisms, your survival rate is somewhere in the 3 to 5% range. So when there were 5 doctors and 1 nurse and 1 technician, when they gave up working on me and went to my wife and said, go say goodbye, and my mother as well, whatever my wife said, somehow, some way, she managed to talk me into a better state of mind, even though she said I was in so much pain that I had a hold of the table in front of me and wouldn't let go of it, was shaking it. And they kept saying, he's going to break the table. He's going to table. He's going to break the table. But it's not just that. So my wife probably, no ifs, ands, or buts, saved my life that night. But when you cut that deep through the muscle fascia, you would not believe how much pain there is. Now, women who've had probably a C-section could probably relate to it, or blowing their abdominal wall apart. Just getting in and out of a chair is incredibly painful. You're talking about an 18-month recovery time frame. And so my wife saved my life then as well, because there was all kinds of stuff I just couldn't do. And my wife's a very strong lady, and she's capable of doing stuff that many men can't do. It's kind of funny at times, actually, to be honest with you. But yeah, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for my wife, Victoria. She absolutely saved my life. And I went through a bad divorce, before I married Cindy. And when I had the very first surgery, I was with my ex-wife. And 2 days after I got out of the hospital, and keep in mind, I can't get in and out of a recliner, or, I can't do barely anything. She decided to go out of state, go visit friends, and left me home alone. And a friend of mine, John Sharman, ended up staying with me and babysat me for a couple of weeks until I was a little bit mobile. But Cindy, complete opposite, definitely saved my life. All the credit goes to her. Plus, she puts up with my craziness. So that's saying something in itself. That's about it.
Uh, you rock, Chris. It sounds like Cindy rocks too. But we're going to end it tonight. Just hold tight. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. And Don, your exceptional behavior tonight, sir.
Oh, good.
Bye.
Good.